So it is the start of the King Holiday Observance. The CEO of the King Center, Dr. Bernice King, joins us. Thank you for the time, as always.
Thank you.
The timing of this holiday observance is so significant, coming off such a historic week. The state of Georgia and the voters here electing the first ever African-American U.S. Senator from our state. And as Reverend Warnock pointed out, also electing the son of an immigrant, a Jewish senator in John Ossoff. And then on the same day we learn those results, we watch a mob take siege of the U.S. Capitol. And in the group of rioters, some known white supremacists identified in messages of racism and anti-Semitism. As you're watching all that unfold, both of those pieces of history, what were you thinking?
Wow, I had a lot of things going through my mind. First of all, in terms of the election contrasted with these actions of insurrection, you know, anytime there is movement towards progress, in particular racial progress, there's always going to be a backlash. My father called it the white backlash. We can call it today the white supremacist backlash. And so it's something that, because of my unique place in terms of being the daughter of Dr. King and Ms. Coretta Scott King, it gives me greater insight and understanding of these kind of things. And so it didn't like shock me. It disappointed me deeply and troubled me as much as I believe my father would have been troubled as well, because it's been 50 years since he really gave us the vision of where we needed to go as a nation in terms of priorities, making people more important than material and things. And because we kind of ignored that not just suggestion, but he ignored that direction, and the strong emphasis by him that we have a revolution of values, these things have now come to the surface. And so that day, as I was watching, first thing as a Black person, you said, wow, this would never happen if those were Black people. There would have been, there would have been tear gas. People would have been shot, arrested. They would have been, beat really bad. And although I don't condone that type of response, I do believe that there should have been forceful resistance by the police as well as the Federal Reserve. It indicated to me as I watched it that this must be an inside job, because nobody gets that far unless there's some kind of inside plan that had been working all along. And so, of course, we know that most of the law enforcement agencies were under the president. And so some of that is because of his position and people cooperating. I mean, this is one instance that we teach in nonviolence. There's a thing called just and unjust laws. And it doesn't mean that laws are just unjust on their face. Sometimes they're unjust in their application. And so this is a time when it really called for courageous leadership on those that were part of the police force to put their very jobs on the line to stop this kind of behavior. The fact that many of them were complicit is very disturbing and troubling. I also thought about my father's quote. On the one hand, he said, riots are the language of the unheard. But the source of a riot, is different than this violence, that's insurrection that we saw. But at the end of the day, if you really, look at it, the people who were part of this insurrection feel like they're unheard. I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong, but they feel like, they're losing someone who represents them and their interests and concerns, although we know many of the interests that come from the white supremacists are totally off base. But at the end of the day, what does that mean? There has to be repercussions on the one hand. I kept saying, there has to be repercussions. This president needs to go. And I know it's a few days left, but if we don't act as a nation to say this is wrong, this is inappropriate, and there are consequences, we're sending the wrong message in terms of future generations, in terms of our democracy and what it means, in terms of our democratic process. And so thank God for those elected officials, who started acting in that way to look at the removal or the impeachment. But on the other hand, I started thinking about the need for us to find a pathway forward to really deal with people who are a part of white supremacy. Do we just ignore them? Do we dismiss them? Do we write them off? Do we just continue to forge forth ahead without even thinking about them? And I would say unequivocally, no, because they are part of our humanity. They're part of our humanity, and they have to be won over. Everybody's not called to the work of winning them over. There's a guy by the name of Daryl Davis, you may have heard of him, who penetrated the Klan in Maryland. He went to meet with them, found out you hate me, but you don't know me. Why? He forged friendships with them. Many of them denounced the Klan, gave them their roles, and some of them are anti-racist activists. And so some of that work has to be done simultaneously. And then the work that we continue to do, which is to create the beloved community, educating and training people in the way of nonviolence as a lifestyle, as opposed to just a social justice tactic. The way of thinking, the way of acting, and the way of speaking that brings about that personal, cultural, and societal transformation, because that's what's needed to weed I won't say weed the people out, but to weed the behavior out. Legislation will control the behavior. Laws that we put in place can ensure that there are certain punishments, but at the end of the day, what do we do so that we can transform even their lives, that they see, the error of their ways, that they understand, that we understand where they're coming from, so that we can begin to change the society for the best and find the common win-win pathway. A lot of the white supremacists, people who get tied into those organizations, come from some brokenness as children. And they get connected to these organizations and they become like family to them. And then they're fed all of this, hateful rhetoric, and they are taught, the wrong things. So can they be untaught? Can they relearn? I believe some of them can. And I think there's a responsibility to do that. I often say to people, it's irresponsible to leave people in their hate and their fear, in their deception, in their white supremacy. And no, everybody is not called, as I said, to that work. But at the end of the day, if the behavior was inexcusable, there should be consequences. But if we don't find another way, this stuff will keep happening over and over and over again, and violence never solves it. Nonviolence is the only way to create ultimate social change and personal transformation.
On the other side of that, how significant, especially given the history of the Deep South and Georgia, is Senator-elect Raphael Warnock's win and Jon Ossoff's win for our state, for the country, and for this moment in time?
Well, certainly it signals that, we are making a turn. The question is, will we continue the momentum? And that's yet to be seen, of course. We always have to realize that the election of any person is not the answer. It's part of the solution, but it's not the answer. That we have to be just as zealous and vigilant and determined in our actions in terms of what we all did strategically to participate in that election. That same energy has to be galvanized around the issues that continue to plague us. You know, the economic inequality, as Daddy called it, triple evils of poverty, racism, and militarism, and all of the offsprings from that. Those are real issues that we have to organize around, just as people organize around this election, because there's only so much that elected officials can do from a policy standpoint. But you can implement laws and they don't carry out their intended purpose if you don't have people galvanized around what that law represents and what we intend for it to accomplish. So there's a lot of work to do, but at least we have the hope that there are people who will continue to support the work of moving our society toward a more just, humane, equitable, peaceful world.
I saw something you wrote maybe within the last 48 hours. You wrote, "We cannot unite around injustice and lies." Where does the country go forward from here? How do we do that?
Well, how do we do what? Because you said we can't unite around, you said, I said, you can't, right. But how do we move forward? Well, you know, it's what I said. We move forward in a very organized fashion to address these systemic problems and issues that we've had for years. People still don't have livable wages. People don't have health care. You know, we have a serious homeless problem. Systemic racism is throughout our society. We all have to use our spaces of influence to do the work of ridding ourselves of systemic racism and systemic inequality. We have to connect, because some of us are disconnected, to organizations that are doing that work. Nobody can be exempt or uninvolved. Now, I know there are people that are going to continue to live their life, but more people have to become actively engaged. You know, the same energy, as I said before, the same zeal with which people became engaged in this past election, we need to quadruple that, because change doesn't just come unless there's a force of energy, you know, and there's this critical mass of people working synergistically toward that change. So I think it's going to take combining, you know, work at the legislative level, at the community level, at the educational level, and all working together towards the same goal, which is creating a more just, humane, peaceful, and equitable environment in our society.
Of all the messages that your father taught, of all the principles, what one stands out to you most that you're really drawing on in this time as we start celebrating this holiday week?
Nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice and not people. I think for the last probably 8 years, you know, we have sought to use our tongue and our behavior to destroy people, to diminish people, to demean people, and we really need to stay focused on the issues that affects our nation and affects people every day. And so that's been my focus. That whenever anything happens, my focus is not on the person as much as the behavior from the person, and how do I address that and still leave them with their human dignity. And that's a hard principle for people to accept, because as soon as people do wrong and injustice, we want to cancel them in this culture we have. But, you know, in the beloved community, you can't cancel people. In the beloved community, you have to work through conflict. You have to fight against, hateful rhetoric and ideologies, but you still have to find a way in love and the power of love to win people over. And so that's the principle that I hold near and dear to my heart and continue to move in.
Even with all that's happening around us, do you find yourself more hopeful than discouraged when you see where we are and where we have yet to go?
I'm cautiously optimistic. I've never seen the level of engagement in our country as I've seen in the last couple of years. I've never seen the kind of leaning in particular from the white community. It's incredible. I mean, people are really seeking to rid our society of these issues, but it's not easy. We have a lot of dark history, and that has, unfortunately, continues to perpetuate itself in our present. So I'm hopeful because there are people that are committed, and some people, as my father would say, who found something worth dying for, and now they're fit to live. And so I think we're going to see some progress, particularly with an administration that won't be seeking to further divide and polarize people, because that's the issue. What has been effective throughout history is divide and conquer. And I think we're living in a time now where we can find connection and common ground to move forward to create that just, humane, peaceful, and equitable world. It doesn't mean we're going to like each other or that we're going to all agree, but we will find a common pathway where we are acting in more humane ways.